more people here than last time. Wait, just by show of hands, like how many people were not here last week? I think it's roughly okay. Actually, most of the people were not here last week. Maybe like 60% of you guys. But I know, but most of you guys watched the recording at least. I know I sent out a message, yes, half. Okay, maybe like 1 or 2 people watched like half of it. So this is gonna build a bit on the concepts from last time. But honestly, I'm just really excited. There's so many people who are like, want to learn more about poker and then want to come, like of course we're gonna play a bit as well. But yeah, this is building off last time. We're gonna go more into tournament strategy. But I also want to step back a second because based on what I saw in last week's free roll, I wanted to cover a couple like core fundamental things and a lot of mistakes I was seeing that's quite common of beginners as well in tournaments. And just a reminder for the new folks, this is more focused on poker tournament strategy as opposed to cash game strategy, but there's a lot of similar things that you can apply to both. Okay, let's jump straight in. Quick recap of last week. The main takeaways from last week was that the difference in incentives when you're playing tournaments versus cash games is that it's about survival as opposed to chip accumulation. 2 is that the general goal of poker is you're trying to win expected value, EV, instead of winning money. And look at like all the games you play in poker is just one big long session, as opposed to like being stressed about like, okay, I lost this game or I won this game and that makes me a good or a bad player. Just focus on making positive EV decisions, and that's ultimately what we're trying to like teach here is like how do you make plus EV decisions. GTO versus exploitative, like what they are, how to use them, and I have a slide that kind of covers this because a few people asked me follow-up questions on this, so I want to just give a bit more depth on this. And then this last piece, which I'm actually going to park, which is ICM, which was like the last takeaway of last session, which is the fact that in tournaments, the chips you lose are worth more than the chips you gain. I'm going to revisit that with a couple scenarios later, but we're going to cover some other things first, just based on what I saw last time. So GTO versus exploitative, because a couple people asked, but quick refresher, again, like game theory optimal or GTO strategy is basically like perfect theoretical poker, or basically how like computers would play like perfectly trained on like millions of hands of poker. And versus exploitative, which is relying on reading opponents, understanding their weaknesses, and then taking certain moves to exploit those weaknesses. So fundamentally, like when should you use them? So you heard me say last time, which is the main thing you want to do is develop a baseline GTO strategy. And I hear a lot of people who will say, oh, well, like, you know, I don't really need to worry about like whatever GTO because I'm really good at exploitative, or I'm really good at reading people. But frankly, like you're not really playing exploitative strategy if you actually don't understand GTO, because you can't necessarily exploit or deviate people if you don't know what you're deviating from. Like you need to establish that baseline. And once you understand both, the real benefit is you want to be able to use both. Because you're going to have, basically when you use GTO is when you have very little information on your opponents, or you're playing against really, really good pros who are generally going to default to a GTO strategy. So you're also going to just try to play GTO and try to reduce your own exploits. And tougher fields, tougher opponents, and in spots that you've studied a lot. So this is like looking at charts. We'll talk a bit about like pre-flop charts today. And then when you want to be exploitative is when you're in a pool of like, obviously like very weak players, where they have a lot of weaknesses, they have a lot of spots where they're making mistakes, where you can just make clear deviations and print EV or print profit. If you have players with more history, so you'll see, I know a lot of the VClub players here play with each other very, very often, so it's almost like purely exploitative. Nobody's really playing GTO ranges, so that happens a lot in these kind of pools. And yeah, when you have like more psychological or like physical tells on a player, that you abandon whatever ranges or study or theory that you know because somebody is just like very obviously like shaking every time they have like the best hand, so you just fold everything. So that's just like quick heuristics of when you want to use kind of like GTO versus exploitative. Yeah, that was the one recap slide on this, but any questions on this? Because I know I had a couple questions about how to use both, what they really were. Okay, cool. So what's to come today? I'm really going to try, because we only got like 30, 40 minutes, I'm going to boil it down to kind of like 3 main areas, which is bet sizing basics, because I saw a lot of bet sizing mistakes last week. And I'm going to be looking them out for this today as well, to make sure nobody's making bet sizing mistakes. 2 is preflop ranges. What are they? We're not going to go into depth of like charts or anything, but I just want to give you some general heuristics of how you should be thinking about ranges. And then 3 is short stack strategy. Because fundamentally in like cash games, you're usually playing at like 100 big blinds deep. You're not really that short stacked very often. You can just add more chips and not be short stacked. Whereas in tournaments, the vast majority of your time, you're going to be playing relatively short stack. So how do you play? What's the strategy, and what does that look like? Yes?
What's a short stack? Sorry.
Short stack is if you have a fewer amount of chips. So if you're thinking about your stack in terms of big blinds, so 100 big blinds is usually what you have in a cash game. Short stack is like, let's say 40 big blinds or less. And most of the range that you'll be playing in tournaments is somewhere between 15 to 40 big blinds. So let's say the big blind is like 100, for example, then you might have like a 4,000 chip stack. Yeah, does that make sense? Or?
Yeah.
So basically when you have like fewer chips relative to the stake of the game is very much determined by the blinds. Hey guys, do you guys need chairs?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess there's 2 here. Maybe if you could help grab.
Well, they could
it
just.
sounds also like 1 or 2 more
You
people.
could just come here.
Okay, or yeah, feel free to grab.
It's okay.
Okay, all right. So the very first question, this is like the #1 biggest mistake I see from like beginner players all the time. Actually, I won't get into what the mistake is because the first is actually just a quiz, a question, is when should you limp pre-flop? I feel like I kind of get away by that preamble. But so just raise your hand if you think is the answer, and then we're just gonna go through each one. So, and limping is just when it's on you, you're the first person to act. Nobody's raised before you, and limping is basically just calling the big blind. So let's say the big blind is like 20, and it comes to you, and you just put 20 in, as opposed to raising or making it higher. That's what a limp is. So do you want to limp, if you think you want to limp when you have a premium hand, like aces or kings, and you want to trap your opponents, raise your hand. Okay, we got a couple people. B, when you're short stacked and don't want to really risk going all in. So again, short stack is when you don't have that many chips. So when you're short stacked, don't have that many chips is more when you want to limp. Okay, nobody thinks it's B. C, never limp. Never. Limping is always bad in poker. Okay, like half of the people. And then lastly, D, when you have like a marginal hand, when that really kind of doesn't want to put a lot of chips in, you just kind of want to see and draw and like hopefully try to hit a hand. Who thinks it's D? Okay, maybe like 10% of people. So most of you got it right. Also, hey, we got 1 seat here. Maybe we can pull 1 more. Yeah, there's actually 2 seats if you guys want to go. Okay, that's up to you guys. Most of you got this right, which is never. Limping is very bad in poker, and really want to make sure none of you guys limp in today's free roll, and I'll explain why. But generally, if you have a good hand, like just raise with it. If you have aces or kings, just raise with it. Try to get more money in. You want to juice up the pot. When you're short stack, we'll talk about short stack strategy, so I won't go too much into that depth about that one. But when you have marginal hands, like you're usually just going to be folding them. There's some marginal hands that you can take and turn into bluffs, but usually just fold them instead of just trying to like see a flop. But really, never. And why? Why is limping bad? Anyone want to take a guess? Yeah, go ahead.
Capture range.
Sorry?
Capture range.
Yes. It captures range in a sense that usually you're not going to be limping with your best hand. And we'll talk about like what ranges are, but it's basically, based on every move that a player makes, this is how you see like really good players on TV, like be able to guess exactly what hand like an opponent has, is because that person has done like a string of like moves that has narrowed their range so much to literally like 1 hand or maybe 2 hands that it becomes really obvious what that person has done, which is what you really want to avoid, because then you become very predictable as a poker player. So you want to be thinking about your hands in ranges and what would you do with a range of hands as opposed to very specific hands. But yeah, so when you limp, usually you're not going to be limping, or you should never really be limping with your best hands. So now, once you limp, your opponents know you never have aces or kings, generally speaking. Any other guesses on why limping is really bad?
Usually, like the aggressor has the advantage in poker, and limping is very passive. So you'd rather be like more aggressive than passive.
Yeah, Yeah, so, and the aggressor has the advantage because you maintain an uncapped range, meaning you can still have, so it's similar, which is you still have all the good hands in your range, so it keeps your opponent guessing more. And ultimately, by making why it's more favorable to be aggressive too, is it allows you to isolate players. So really, and this is kind of like the fundamental thing for folks to understand, is that limping leads to multi-way pots, and you just can't win EV in multi-way pots. So being aggressive and raising, putting more money in, forces more people to fold, which allows you to isolate a smaller number of players, which allows you to win more EV. If you have a good hand, and of course you're going to mix it with bluffs because you want to have a balanced range, which we'll talk more about later. But that's ultimately why limping is really bad, is you just can't win in limp pots. I mean, you can literally win like that pot, but in the long term, you're just going to be losing EV. And here's kind of an example, like, let's say you limped with pocket aces. So this just shows it mathematically. Let's say you limp with pocket aces and like 5 random hands call you. Even with pocket aces, your equity, which we talked about last week, is only 30% to win this hand. If you just, go to showdown, which means even with the best hand in poker, you're losing 70% of the time, which just goes to show, like, you do not want to be playing multi-way pots with your good hands, with your, your bad hands obviously can be folding, but like, you just don't want to be playing multi-way pots. So that comes to what's the converse of limping is you raise. And what do you guys think is the goal of a preflop raise? I think I kind of give it away with why we don't limp, but yeah.
To isolate?
Yes, to isolate. To get as many players out of the hand as possible. I throw in some other like poker jargon or words that you might hear, but like isolation and equity denial, which is having other people fold away their hands and their equity. Increasing the size of the pot, adding more money in, which is a form of equity capitalization. And narrowing the range of hands your opponents can have. So similar how Pei mentioned that when you limp, you narrow your range where your opponents now know you can't have the best hands. When you raise and somebody calls, or depending on what they do, if they call, you know that they're probably not calling a raise with their trash hands. So you can immediately throw, let's say like the bottom, like 30-40% of poker hands out, and you kind of narrow the range that you have your opponents on. So it helps you better understand what cards that your opponents are going to be playing. So that's the goal of preflop raise, and so now we know to not limp. So now, and the importance of a preflop raise, and just sharing kind of like a very basic chart of what you should be using in terms of raise sizing, because I saw raise sizings all over the board. And generally in cash games, you're probably going to have a pretty standard raise size of around like 3x of the big blind. So if the big blind's $2, you're going to raise to $6. In like lower stakes games, it tends to be higher. But the difference in tournaments is it's largely more of a function of what the average or the effective stack size is at the table. So looking at, and I would say effective stack size, I would say actually focus more for beginners, focus on your own stack size, and then just use that as the main heuristic for how you're going to determine your raise size. And if this even is like a little too much to think about and you're not used to converting your stack size into big blinds, then just default to 2x. And like that is honestly like going to be totally fine. Whereas like you don't really see that in cash games, like people aren't raising 2x, but that is very, very common in tournaments, especially as stack sizes get shallower and shallower. And what I mean by shallower is like people will have an average stack size that becomes lower and lower as the tournament progresses, just by nature of the blinds increasing in a tournament kind of format. So any questions around that? So you'll kind of see it's basically a range from 2 to 3 big blinds. So when we start in this tournament today, your raise size should be like 3 big blinds or 2.5 big blinds. I think the starting level is like 10-20, so that's 50 to 60 chips that you're raising. But then once we get into the deeper levels, then you're really only raising for 2x the big blind. And that's the reason why that's lower compared to cash games is again a function of the fact that the chips you lose are worth more than the chips you gain. So you don't really need to raise as high to put the same amount of pressure that you do in a cash game scenario to make people fold. Yeah.
If we all know that you shouldn't limp and like you should be putting in like 2 to 3 big blinds, does that not effectively become limping by putting in 2 to 3 big blinds? we all agree that that is what you should be doing?
No, it doesn't become limping, because now what happens is that by not limping, so normally you might have had a limping range that allowed you to play 80% of hands, where you just chose, or let's say you fold only the bottom 20%, maybe you took 40% of hands, 50% of hands, and you decide to limp with them, and then you only raise maybe the top 20, 30%. So by not limping, you get to just eliminate a lot more garbage hands from your range, which is actually what good poker looks like. It's basically a lot of like recreational players just play way too many hands. So by not limping, you eliminate probably like the bottom, whatever, 60, 70% of hands, and then you're playing better hands, generally speaking. And so like your opponents will know that you're probably playing better hands, and you theoretically should have a tighter range because you're putting more money in. But then that's better poker because you'll be balanced with a better range of hands because they're going to be stronger hands in general. That makes sense.
It doesn't exactly make sense, because like if someone's the first person to raise and they put in like 3 big blinds, is everybody who's not, like, if everybody calls from there on out, like would that be bad poker then? Or you're going to talk about like why that would be bad if everybody called like the first pre-flop raise if it's a small one?
Right, so you're saying if they call the raise versus if they just like called.
Yeah, because calling a small raise is essentially like limping if everyone does it, right? If you're the first to...
If everyone does it and nobody's adjusting their ranges, but by simply the act of raising what the minimum call is now, because now let's say the blind is 20 and then you've raised it to 60. So people should be calling with a smaller grouping of hands for 60 than 20, just because it's more expensive, right? So like intuitively, when it's more expensive, you don't want to call with as much garbage hands. So everybody who calls behind is not necessarily the same as limping. And you are going to see people who raise, and then calling is very, very different from limping, because you're going to have hands that want to call that are decent hands that wouldn't have wanted to just like limp pre-flop. So it is different. It'll make more sense if we like look at charts and you kind of compare side by side. But yeah, hopefully that makes a little more sense.
It makes more sense.
Okay, cool. I saw there were a couple other questions. Yes.
So is limping always kind of the worst strategy, or is it just never the best strategy?
Limping is just not a strategy. It just doesn't exist in poker. In like good theoretical poker, limping, it exists in a very specific scenario, which is like small blind versus big blind, and everybody folds to the small blind, and the small blind does have a lot of limps. But I wouldn't even get into that strategy. I think if you just like never limp, just like assume you should never limp, like it just doesn't really exist in good theoretical poker.
Even if you have like 7 deuce off, you're in the big blind and it limps to you.
And in that case you're not limping, because then you don't have to put any more money in. You could just check.
Okay.
Right. You
sure.
could just check.
That's
and
not
you get
considered
to see
limping.
That's not considered limping.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like, at least what I was thinking when you're asking that question is like, the point of the small blind and the big blind is to incentivize people like to win that. So like if you just limp and then it limps around, the big blind can just go into the pot for free. So you're not like winning that blind.
You learn no information about the big blind, because they get to basically play 100% of their hands, either by checking or raising. They could basically have any hand. And very likely you're gonna probably get some other people along the way too. So.
What's your opinion on limping as a sign of like trapping strength, or would you advise against it usually, as it like invokes too much risk at hand?
I would advise against it, because
it could work though.
Because the cases where we looked at the case where like you have pocket aces and you limp and you get 5 callers, like you're just like hating life. You're like now not a favorite to win this hand.
Yeah.
Whereas otherwise you would have like ideally won like a hand, like in the long term, like, and you look at people's like when they play like online poker and they have reports of like how much money they've won off certain hands, just like statistically aces, you're just gonna win the most amount of money. Right, you're not going to win every hand, but like over the course of the game, because it's the best hand in poker. Mm-hmm. So when you have these situations where you just don't get to maximize your EV, it's just not good. Yeah. So like you'll see people do it, and I say this because also like it's a thing to recognize when you go play in other places as well. If you see other people limping, you can also recognize that they're generally probably less studied. They're probably not good poker players. So you can understand some population tendencies around how to exploit them and how to play against them. But yeah, I would just generally advise to never limp.
Okay.
What is the etymology of the term limping when used in poker?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know actually. If somebody else knows the answer to that, do you know?
No.
Okay.
That was just a joke.
But no, it's a great question. I'll look it up after. Okay, last one, and then we're gonna move on.
So what is the EV of like limping? If it is like 100% you're gonna lose, then you know what, like, you know, you gotta randomize your strategy sometimes, right? But if you say the world's best player just limp, what's the implication of that? It's just confused other people, or?
You're never going to see the world's best player limp. I can tell you that. Like in these situations, just understand that limping is always negative EV. So if you choose to limp today, just know that you are throwing EV out the window. That's the only thing you need to know. If you're not, like the only situation again is small blind versus big blind, everybody folds to you and you're in the small blind, you do actually have a lot of limps, but that's like the only situation. Every other situation you're supposed to theoretically have 0 limps. Okay, cool. So the next concept here is 3-betting. So I just pulled a graphic online on kind of what 3-betting is. So like the initial raise, so let's say the blinds are $1, $2. Somebody makes that initial raise to $6, which is 3 times the big blind. That is like a raise or like a 2-bet. It's weird like naming convention, but if somebody now re-raises that initial raise and makes it more, that is a 3-bet. And a 3-bet is a very, very powerful move in poker and one of your greatest tools. And the main goal of it is fundamentally the same as why you raise in the first place, is again for kind of like isolation, equity denial. It just does a much better job of it, because in the situation that Derek mentioned, which is somebody raises and then you have, let's say 2 or 3 people call and you have pocket aces on the button, right? You don't want to just call and now play a multi-way pot. You want to 3-bet or raise and try to isolate 1 or 2 players with a really good hand. So ultimately, preflop 3-betting, again, same goal as preflop raising, which is just isolation plus putting more money in. And I think one thing, and this really applies more to cash games especially, but also applies to tournaments. Like the most profitable setup / formation in poker is being heads up, which is heads up means there's only 2 players going to the flop or post flop, and you're in position. And this is like the formation that you will make the most money in poker. So the reason why 3-betting is so great is because it is the best tool to get you into this exact position. Is ideally you want to go to a flop with just you and one other person, and you're in position, which means you get to act after them. Because that's where you have the most leverage. You get to be aggressive, you get to make bluffs, you get to also go for a ton of value. It's just a lot of good things can happen when you're in this formation. Okay. So 3-bet sizing, just some basic kind of like heuristics behind it, or like just basic like framework for sizing. But if you're in position, so let's say the initial raiser made it to $6 and you have pocket aces on the button, so you have position on them, then in general is you want to 3x their raise sizing. So if they made it 6, then you want to make it 18. Versus when you're out of position, let's say it folds around to you in the small blind, you have pocket aces, then you want to make it 24 in this case, which is 4x. So yeah, honestly, you don't really need to be creative with your preflop sizings. It's very, very simple. I think just be consistent. Like you don't want to go for like 10x when you have pocket aces and then make it like 3x when you have like 9, 10 suited. Because again, you want to not be predictable. You don't want to be, because sizing tells is a very, very obvious one that a lot of beginners will have, is they'll make it either big or small with their best hands and vice versa, and it becomes really obvious to good players. So try to keep it simple, and for like, if you're very, very new, I'll just say like use that, your initial raise, just use 2x, and just do that whenever you want to put more money in the pot if you're the first raiser. And if you're going to try to re-raise someone, if you have a good hand, then just make it 3x or 4x, somewhere between there, you're going to be totally fine.
Are these multiples different in cash games versus tournaments? And is this for tournaments?
This is more specific for tournaments, but I would say this applies to cash games. I basically use the same in cash games as well. I'll just adjust in cash games depending on how loose the players are and how like, because again, if you like 3-bet and then you're still getting 3-4 callers, like then the function of your 3-bet is not really working. So you want to, okay, we need to experiment. We need to raise it higher or higher to like try to get in that heads up formation. But great question. Okay, cool. So we're getting to preflop ranges now, which is so like what is a preflop range? It's basically, I mentioned already, is like the way you want to think about your hand is about a range of hands as opposed to a very specific hand. And it's basically the range of hands that you'll want to play from a given position. So depending on what the action was that came up beforehand. And the main things to consider that impact the hands that you play are position. So, and generally speaking, in early position, you want to play a tighter range, which means a fewer range of hands. So a fewer percentage of all hands you'll want to play. And in later position, when you have more position on other players, you're going to want to play more hands. And generally speaking, that's because positional advantage, or having position on other players is a huge advantage in poker. Getting to act after other players allows you to get, a couple more pieces of information. And because of that advantage, you get to play more hands, apply more pressure in certain spots. 2 is stack size. So generally speaking, the more chips you have, you're gonna have more flexibility to play a few more hands. Whereas the fewer chips you have, you're gonna want to tighten up your range and play fewer hands. And then lastly is like table dynamics. So I think, depending on like if your table is very, very aggressive or loose or calling a lot of hands, and you want to kind of adjust your range accordingly based on that. And that's more exploitative than like GTO, but it's just something to be aware of as how people kind of like adjust their ranges. So this is like a basic sort of like range chart, in case you've never seen a poker range chart in your entire life. It's basically a 13 by 13 grid of all the possible like poker hands you can have. So it starts from like along the like intersection here is like all the pocket pairs, so like aces through pocket twos. Everything in like the upper right half of this is like suited cards. So like 3 deuce suited, ace deuce suited, etc. These are all like suited hands. And then everything below here is all the offsuit combinations of those kind of like same hands. So this represents kind of like basically everything in red is representing like these are hands that you'll want to raise with. And this is like 16% of hands and represents, I think, 100. I think I pulled this from if you had a stack size of 100 big blinds and you're raising from under the gun, or you're the first person to act. Like, so just puts in perspective, you're only raising with about 16% of hands when you're playing under the gun with 100 big blinds. So question now for you guys, and I want you guys to actually pull out your phones, just like open up a notes doc to answer these questions, and then we'll kind of go through them. But if you have, and this is not the chart for this scenario, so this was just an example chart. If you have 40 big blinds and you're in these 3 positions, what percentage of hands do you think you should be playing? Based on kind of like the general heuristics I mentioned to you, that like generally from earlier position, so under the gun, you're playing fewer hands. Later position on the button, you're playing more hands. So what does that percentage difference look like? This again is an example of like 16% of hands. So this is a pretty tight range of hands. So you're playing, like only like really good aces, decent amount of pocket pairs, like all your suited Broadway cards, like King 10 suited. We'll give folks like 30 seconds to just throw some guesses in there, and then we'll go through this. But any other questions also in the meantime? Okay. Cool. Everyone got the guesses? Yes. Okay. So we'll walk through this first from under the gun to button. So under the gun, you're looking at 19% of hands. So again, a pretty tight range. And generally from under the gun, this is going to be the tightest range of hands that you play in poker. So you always want to be aware of your position, and that dramatically impacts what percentage of hands you're playing. So basically, if you're first to act and you look at any of these hands, then you should be raising. And you should raise to your 2x sizing, 2.5x sizing, whatever size you choose. And so again, these are pretty strong hands. You get to play a lot of suited aces, half of the suited kings. And I think people might ask, like, okay, why are there like, why are you playing ace 3 suited, but you're not playing like ace 9 off? But generally in like GTO strategy, like the computers really prefer suited combos of hands versus non-suited, and especially the suited combos of ace X and like king X, just because you have the more potential of flopping really strong flushes, like the second or the nut flush or the second high nut flush. So I won't go into like the very deep detail around it, but this is just how the computer thinks when it thinks about constructing ranges. But yeah, so 19% of hands when you're from under the gun. If we go to the next one, you see how it jumps from 19%, it almost doubles to 29% just by being a few positions later. So now you're in the hijack, and now you get to play a lot more hands. Like you got King 4 suited, Queen 6 suited, 10-7 suited, Jack 7 suited, some kind of like garbage looking hands, but you get to play a lot more hands just because you're in a later position. And then on the button where you're supposed to be the widest, it almost doubles again, which is now you're playing like 50% of all like starting hands in poker, which is a lot of hands. You get to raise a lot of time. And again, this is if it folds to you and you get to be the first person to act and decide whether you want to raise or fold. So that just illustrates how drastically it went from 19% to 50% of hands, because I think a lot of beginners will just think, okay, I have a good hand and I'm just gonna raise, and they're not really thinking about positions and how that impacts the range of hands that they want to play. But this like almost triples the amount of hands that you want to play just based on what position you're sitting at the table and where the button is with respect to where you are. Yes.
Are these tournament pre-flop ranges?
Yes, this is all tournament pre-flop ranges.
Okay.
Yes.
I know, like in tournaments, when you're short stack, you have to. A lot of the times, like you see people just going all in with like a big range. So like, how short stack you have to be? Like, how many big blinds you have to be? Or, sorry.
We're gonna cover it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like what's the threshold for like all in or full territory?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll cover that. Cool. And then this is just illustrating the other piece, which is like, depending on how large your stack is, this also impacts your range. So this is like on the button at 100 big blinds. So I think we saw it at, this was on the button at 40 big blinds. So you go from 56 to 51%. So the more big blinds you have, you get to generally play more hands. And then if you go down to 30 big blinds, that drops to 48. So you see it like slightly just takes off a few more hands from your range as your stack size gets lower.
Earlier when you showed the under the gun open, it was like the opposite.
Yes, so I'd say under the gun is more unique. So the opposite, where it was like 19% from under the gun with 40 big blinds, where this is like 100 big blinds. Ignore that labeling, but this is for 100 big blinds, and this is about 16% of hands. To be honest, I don't know why the computer does this. I think it's still like very, very close. It's not like a big swing, it's like a couple percentage points. So I wouldn't sweat it too much, but generally amongst all the other positions, that general heuristic applies, which is the more big blinds you have, you get to add a few more combos or add a couple percentage more points of hands to your range. Okay. So this is coming to your question, Delwyn, which is like a lot of people actually asked about like short stack strategy, and like fundamentally, because I mentioned at the beginning of this, most of the time in tournaments you're going to be between this 15 to 40 big blind range, which you're almost like really never in a cash game. So it's quite uncomfortable, especially for like cash game players who don't really know what to do with this. And I heard like a lot of people say like, oh, like I'm like so short stacked right now, and they had like 30 big blinds. And honestly, 30 big blinds is a lot in a tournament. Like, I will play like a multi-day tournament, and I literally never have more than 30 big blinds for like literally like 2-3 days. And like, you get a lot of maneuverability, but a lot of like beginner players who don't play with or aren't used to that, they just think that they have to go all in or fold as soon as you get to like, I don't know, less than 40 big blinds. So there's a lot of nuance to it, but I'll kind of just from a high level go over like what is your primary strategy when we break down the most common like big blind stack depths that you'll be playing at in a tournament. And so basically I broke it down into like different stack zones, which is like stack zone 1, which is like 10 big blinds or less, where generally if you're 10 big blinds or less, your strategy effectively kind of plays the same. Second is between, well, that should be 11 to 20 big blinds, and then 21 to 30, 31 to 40. And then anything above 40, you've got like piles of chips in a tournament. So it'll kind of, we'll talk about what your main strategy is. But when you're 10 big blinds or less, like that's really the only time that you start to get into like, your only move is really all in or fold. So even all the way down to like, 11, 12 big blinds, you still have some just raising for 2 big blinds in your strategy, depending on the position, of course. But it's really important to understand, because people will think that they should just be going all in or fold, but really that doesn't happen. That's not your only move until you're like 10 big blinds or less. In the 10 to 20 big blind range in this stack zone, your primary strategy is 3-bet all in. And just to clarify, what I mean by your primary strategy, I mean like how you want to, like your primary way of like how you want to put your money in to kind of like maximize EV. And because now you have a stack size that's large enough that actually has fold equity, meaning if somebody raises to 2 big blinds and you go all in for like 15 big blinds, they have to seriously think before calling. They can't just call any 2 cards. Whereas if you have 8 big blinds and somebody raised for 2 big blinds and you raise all in, then they kind of have to call just based on the pot odds. But now you have real fold equity when you 3-bet all in, and you don't really have a 3-bet sizing that's not all in, because you just don't have enough chips to put a non-all-in 3-bet size. I know I'm like tossing a lot of the terms. I know this might be a little fast for like the newer players, so just like feel free to jump in or like pull me aside after if you guys have questions. But yeah, your main primary strategy really here is to 3-bet all in. So like you see somebody else open or raise basically for 2 big blinds, you have a good hand, you wake up with like king queen suited or ace queen suited, ace king suited, you're happy to just like go all in, and then you're very happy if they just fold, because then you get the 2 big blinds from the initial raiser plus the 2.5 big blinds from all the blinds, and you've basically added 25% to your stack by not even like risking your stack at all. So that's a phenomenal outcome. You get to add somewhere between 25 to 50% of your stack by not really risking anything. So that's why it's your primary strategy. In the 21 to 30 big blind range or stack zone, your primary strategy is really just open raising. You're going to have some 3-bets as well for the non-all-in sizing, but it becomes still like you end up risking a lot of your stack at this step still, where generally you're just going to want to open raise. Hopefully you like just either take down the blinds, or you get like 1 caller and then play some post flop and hope to win a pot. But that's going to be your primary strategy. Once you get to the 31 to 40 big blind stack zone depth, like this is where you're going to be pretty comfortable in tournaments, because now you get to really put push on, and you get to 3-bet for the non-all-in sizing. You get to do it at like a normal frequency or a normal amount of times that you should be doing it with based on like the ranges. But yeah, basically, and again, we mentioned how like 3-betting is your greatest tool, and now you have enough chips to be able to 3-bet without risking your whole stack. So you want to be able to leverage that, get in position, play against one player, and then win a bunch of chips from them. And then when you're 41 big blinds plus, this kind of is just becoming like not quite like a cash game, because you still have like 100 big blinds plus, but like your primary strategy again just becomes like open raising. A lot of people are just going to have less chips than you, and they're going to fold. So you just get to open raise, take down blind swap, or maybe play against like 1 or 2 opponents and just apply pressure because you've got piles of chips. Cool. Any questions? I know I went through that pretty quickly, and there's a lot more nuances. Like there's like secondary strategies and tertiary strategies between each of these like stack zones. But I just wanted to cover like primary strategy today. Yeah. Any questions on any of this? Yes.
So what's the intuition between like 20 to 30 big blinds? It seems like very different from when you have less or more chips.
What's the intuition?
Yeah. Like why like if it's can be explained kind of heuristically, or
Like why is it so different? Well, because basically both of these guys want a 3-bet versus like why is that one just like open raising? Is that what you mean, or
like, what's the intuition behind it? It seems like.
Yeah, so I mean basically because when I talk about primary, like you're still going to have 3-bet in your strategy. So I'm not saying, to be very clear, this is not your only strategy. I'm just talking about like what is going to be the general move that's going to put you in a position to probably win the most chips in a tournament depending on your stack size. So what this only means is that like you're going to be doing more open raising. You're not going to be doing as much 3-betting as you are when you have 31 to 40 big blinds, because if you raise, if you 3-bet, it's risking now a much larger percentage of your stack compared to when you have more chips. So that's the main intuition behind it, which is just like you're just risking more, so you're going to be more careful and selective when you 3-bet. Whereas when you have more chips, you get to do it a little more liberally and feel a little more comfortable. And if you 3-bet and then somebody 4-bet goes all in on you, like you can still fold and not be like really short stacked.
Sorry, just to clarify, for the 10 to 20 big blinds, so are you 3-betting and then on the flop going all in?
No, great question. This means when you 3-bet, you don't have a non-all-in size for your 3-bet anymore. Meaning when you 3-bet, you have to go all in. Because you can't raise, because a normal, for example, normally people are going to raise to 2 big blinds, and a normal 3-bet size if you're in position would be 3x their raise, so that would be 6 big blinds. And let's say you had 15 big blinds. If you 3-bet to 6 big blinds and then they just call, and now there's 6 plus 6 plus 2.5 of the other small blind, big blind in the middle, that's 14.5 big blinds in the middle, and then you now only have 9 big blinds behind. You basically just don't have enough chips left behind to have sizings post-flop to make sense, and they get to call a lot. So I know that was a lot of words, but basically just know that if you're 20 big blinds or less, if you're going to 3-bet, instead of going for a standard like 6 big blind size, you should be going all in.
So what's the difference between just going all in and then 3-bet all, like, it's just going all in?
Yeah, it is effectively going all in, and you do get some just like open going all in at this stack depth as well. I'm just saying that what I mean by primary strategy is you're gonna make like the most money when this is like your most favorable strategy, meaning you're gonna probably make the most money or make most chips doing this, but you're also gonna get to just go open all in and then also just steal 2.5 big blinds. The reason why 3-betting all in, like when somebody raises and you 3-bet all in, is you get to steal 2 more blinds from the initial person who raised.
Oh.
So that's why it's just something, it prints a bit more EV for you when you do that, which is why it becomes a primary strategy. But you definitely do still have open raises in your strategy and open jams, open all-ins. I saw another hand somewhere. Is there?
What's your advice for those of us that can't count how much money is in the pot or in our stack?
I would say, so it is a very, very important skill in tournament poker specifically, and honestly it took me a while to get used to, and I would mix up sizings like all the time because I would miscount, because it becomes very hard to think about your stack in terms of big blinds. Honestly, I would use a calculator. I even see pros sometimes still use a calculator. Like, you know the big blind is like 20, and you know what your stack is in terms of chips. So at least I would say don't stress too much if you don't know what everyone else's stack size, but at least for today, try to know at least what your stack size is in big blinds. And if you need to at least like put it on a calculator, it's totally fine. Like the whole purpose of this tournament is like you guys get practice. So yeah, use a calculator. You know, you have 4,000 chips, the big blind's 20, or the big blind's 200, so you've got 20 big blinds. And then you kind of just, I would say like get used to it. You know, kind of like these mental shortcuts. Like if somebody raises on the button and I call in the big blind, I know that that's 5.5 big blinds now in the pot. And then just based on them raising 2 big blinds, I call 2 big blinds. There's a 1 big blind ante and then half a big blind in the small blind. So you kind of develop these like mental shortcuts, but yeah, I would just say kind of like practice. Like today's kind of a good practice for doing that. And if that's also a lot, then just try to get your sizings right and then focus on knowing your stack in big blinds later on, but take it one step at a time, because I know this is a lot.
So say if you're in zone 2, right, and some other people who got more chips got pulled into this 3-bet situation, would you say like the player in zone 2 has like an advantage in this? Because somehow they got pulled in, right?
If you are in zone, so like let's say you're in zone 2,
yeah,
and then another player has more chips than you?
Yeah, another 2 players got more chips, and I managed to, get them all.
Like, you get more optionality the more like chips that you have, right? Like, you get to use a non-all-in sizing for your 3-bet when you have between that 31 to 40 chips. So like, if somebody drops from like, zone 4 down to zone 2, like that's pretty devastating, because now if they 3-bet, they have to go all in and they have to risk all their chips versus having a non-all-in sizing. So yeah, like you understand how this affects like other people's strategy and like what options they have. But I think
because like compared to like if you're in zone 1, like in zone.
We'll take one last question and then we'll jump to playing.
Somebody who's 10 big blinds or less goes all in. Like, what's your thought process? Like, depending on like if you're the next to act after them, depending on how many you have.
Yeah. So this is where in poker, like good poker players will have studied the charts